In the next couple of slides, we're going to bring this documentation trail to life and point out the real-world ramifications of the importance related to complete, consistent, and correct documents. Each document, and in this run we'll be looking at three, different situations, different buyers, different sellers, different countries, different products. So it'll bring, again, a different real-world flavor, a non-U.S. centric flavor to what we're talking about. In this first look, it's a purchase order, and it is indeed, we'll start with the United States, but we won't limit ourselves to the United States. So we're talking about a purchase order here. A company wants to buy something from another company. And in our example, it's Dundee, the buyer, the company that's placing the PO is called Dundee Medical Diagnostics, and they're in Canton, Ohio, which is also home to the National Football League Hall of Fame, although we won't be talking about that here. Some of the details that help us achieve consistency, completeness, and correctness across the entire documentation trail can be seen here. Start off upper right, purchase order number. This is an internal reference number, more than likely systems generated by Dundee Medical Diagnostics. The sales quote reference number, this is a good cross-reference tool. Before we, let's say we are Dundee Medical Diagnostics, before we place the purchase order, this purchase order, we probably asked the seller, which is Sino Hospital Equipment in Hong Kong, to provide us with a quotation. That quotation, we may have received that 30 days ago, even longer, 60 days. So when we do place a purchase order, it's always a good practice, if you can, to reference the original sales quote from the vendor, in this case, Sino Hospital Equipment. So they can go back and say, we don't remember this quotation. We make hundreds of them a month. They can go back and check and find out what it was, and if all of this information, everything here from below, is indeed consistent. So some good cross-referencing practices right from the beginning. So our seller is the company in Hong Kong. Let's look at some more of the details, starting left to right. What's the purchase order date? Well, November 15th, 2000 and something. The requisitioner is Renee Smith. Maybe Dundee Medical has a buying team of 15 people, 10 people. It's always good to know who the buyer is. So if Sino has any questions, they can go back to that specific person. Some other things that we've brought up and start to come to light, mode of transport. We mentioned that a couple of times. You'd be amazed at the amount of confusion that can arise between whether a shipment was meant to be ocean freight or air freight, and whether it was supposed to go truck and a NAFTA shipment, or maybe rail from Spain to France. It sounds silly and mundane, but you have to have these points from the very beginning. Incoterms rule. We'll talk about these in considerable detail when we get to our module on logistics, but suffice to say for now that the Incoterms, the international commercial terms, they are shipping terms. We mentioned some of them before. Ex-works, free carrier, delivered at terminal. This one happens to be CFR, cost and freight, Long Beach. That means something in a very particular way. We won't go into the details of what it means until we get to that logistics module. Point being for here is that you have to have it on the PO. Purchasing terms, another. Is it 30 days? Did we negotiate 60 days credit from Sino? Do we need a letter of credit, a site draft? That should be there too. And all of this, by the way, all of this info, consistent with the original agreement or the sales quote. The seller would have tried to stipulate many of these items. Behind the scenes, prior to the PO being placed, we went back and forth and negotiated. Sino quoted us as Dundee. We went back and forth, had a few questions. We wanted a different Incoterm. We wanted different terms. This is what we agreed to. The point is, it has to be consistent with that agreement. That's the essence of the documentation trail. Our quantity is 4. The unit of measure, simply racks. More specifically, metal racks for medical diagnostic equipment. This seems like a fairly innocuous and common sense part of a purchase order. But When you think about things like classifying merchandise for customs clearance, determining harmonized system numbers for that classification, presenting information to, in this case, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, this is so important, because that same product description, when goods actually move, Sinai Hospital has to put that description on their commercial invoice, so we as the importer can classify the goods and determine if we owe any customs duties and clear through customs. When we talk about complete, consistent, and correct, all elements are important. This one is especially important. Unit price, you always want to designate the currency to avoid confusion, and by the way, negotiate the currency ahead of time. That's US dollars, 7,817. We have a last ship date, which coincides nicely with our own planning activities, especially from a lead time offsetting perspective. For a total CFR price, that relates back up to our Incoterms conversation, of $31,268. So this is a simple purchase order. You may add some other details, but for our first look at a document, this one being a PO, it's solid, it's consistent, it illustrates the points of the documentation trail, complete, consistent, and correct, and allows us to move on. We'll see more of these moving forward, especially when we look at the export side of our activities, as well as the customs component. So let's continue.